The Pershing was the first operational heavy tank of the United States Army. It was designated a heavy tank when it was designed in WWII due to its 90 mm gun, which was at the time the largest caliber gun standard on an American tank. In 1957, the U.S. developed the M103 tank, which had an even larger 120 mm gun, and the M26 Pershing was redesignated as a medium tank. The tank is named after General John J. Pershing, who led the American Expeditionary Force in Europe in World War I. It was briefly used both in World War II and in the Korean War. Intended as an improvement of the M4 Sherman, the prolonged time of development meant that only a small number saw combat in the European theater, most notably in the 9th Armored Division's dramatic dash to take the bridge at Remagen. In combat it was, unlike the M4 Sherman, fairly equal in firepower and protection to both the Tiger I and Panther tanks, but was underpowered and mechanically unreliable. This became even more evident in the Korean War, where the M26, while an overmatch for the T-34-85, had severe problems with the hilly terrain and was withdrawn in 1951 in favor of its improved derivative, the M46 Patton, which had a more powerful and reliable engine. The lineage of the M26 continued with the M47 Patton, and was reflected in the new designs of the later M48 Patton and M60 Patton. History, development. The M26 was the culmination of a series of tank prototypes that began with the T-20 in 1942 and represented a significant design departure from the previous line of U.S. Army tanks that had ended with the M4 Sherman. A number of design features were tested in the various prototypes, some of which were experimental dead ends, but many of which would become permanent characteristics of subsequent modern U.S. Army tanks. The prototype series began as a medium tank upgrade of the M4 Sherman and ended as the U.S. Army's first operational heavy tank. Improving on the M4, the Army's first lineage of tanks had evolved from the M1 combat car and progressed to the M2 light tank, M2 medium tank, M3 Lee, and finally the M4 Sherman. These tanks all shared the common traits of using rear-mounted Continental air-cooled radial aircraft engines and a front sprocket drive. The rear-engine front sprocket drive layout required a drive shaft to cross underneath the turret, which increased the overall height of the tank, a characteristic shared with German tanks of World War II that also used this layout. In addition, the large diameter of the radial engines in the M4 line of tanks added further to the hull height. These mechanical features accounted for the high silhouette and large side sponsons that were characteristic of the M4 lineage. In the spring of 1942, as the M4 Sherman was entering production, U.S. Army Ordnance began work on a follow-up tank. The T-20 tank reached a mock-up stage in May 1942, and was intended as an improved medium tank to follow the M4. An earlier heavy tank, the M6 had been standardized in February 1942, but proved to be a failure. The U.S. Army had no doctrinal use for a heavy tank at the time. T-20. The T-20 was designed to have a more compact hull compared to the M4. The Ford GAN V8, a lower silhouette version of the GAA engine used in later variants of the M4, had become available. The engine had originally been an effort by Ford to produce a V12 liquid-cooled aircraft engine patterned after the Rolls-Royce Merlin, but failed to earn any aircraft orders and so was adapted as a V8 for use in tanks. Use of this lower-profile engine together with the choice of a rear transmission and rear sprocket drive layout made it possible to lower the hull silhouette and eliminate the side sponsons. The T-20 was fitted with a new 76 mm M1A1 gun, developed from the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. The 3-inch front hull armor was 0.5 in thicker than the 63 mm front armor of the M4. The glacis plate slope was similar at 46 degree. The T-20's overall weight was approximately the same as the M4. The T-20 used an early version of the horizontal volute spring suspension, another improvement compared to the less robust vertical volute spring suspension of the early versions of the M4. Later prototypes of the M26 tested a torsion bar suspension, which would become the standard for future U.S. tank suspension systems. T-22 and T-23. The T-22 series reverted to the M4 transmission because of problems with the early torque-matic transmission used in the T-20. The T-22E1 tested an autoloader for the main gun, and eliminated the loader's position with a small two-man turret. Through much of 1943, there was little perceived need within the U.S. Army for a better tank than the 75 M4 Sherman, and so, lacking any insights from the rest of the Army as to what was needed, the Ordnance Department next took a developmental detour into electrical transmissions with the T-23 series. The electrical transmission was built by General Electric, and had the engine driving a generator that powered two traction motors. The concept was similar to the drive system of the German Porsche Tiger. It had performance advantages in rough or hilly terrain, where the system could better handle the rapid changes in torque requirements. The electrical transmission T-23 was championed by the Ordnance Department during this phase of development. After the initial prototypes were built in early 1943, an additional 250 T-23 tanks were produced from December 1943. These were the first tanks in the U.S. Army with the 76 M1A1 gun to go into production. However, the T-23 would have required that the Army adopt an entirely separate line of training, repair, and maintenance, and so was rejected for combat operations. The primary legacy of the T-23 would thus be its production cast turret, which was designed from the outset to be interchangeable with the turret ring of the M4 Sherman. The T-23 turret was used on all production versions of the 76 M4 Sherman, as the original M475 turret was found to be too small to easily mount the 76 M1A1 gun. The first production 76 M4 with the T-23 turret, the M4E6, was built in the summer of 1943. T-25 and T-26. The T-25 and T-26 lines of tanks came into being in the midst of a heated internal debate within the U.S. Army in the mid-1943 to early 1944 over the need for tanks with greater firepower and armor. A 90mm gun mounted in a massive new turret was installed in both series. The T-26 series were given additional frontal hull armor, with the glacis plate increased to 4 in. This increased the weight of the T-26 series to over 40 short tons and decreased their mobility and durability as the engine and powertrain were not improved to compensate for the weight gain. The T-26E3 was the production version of the T-26E1 with a number of minor modifications made as a result of field testing. Following its introduction into combat, it was renamed the M26 in March 1945. After the war, post-World War II, some 800 M26 tanks were upgraded with improved engines and transmissions and 90mm gun and were redesignated as the M46 Patton. Delayed production, the M26 was introduced late into World War II and saw only a limited amount of combat. Controversy continues to exist as to why the production of the M26 was so delayed. In his 1998 book Death Traps, Belton Cooper, who was a lieutenant in the 3rd Armored Division during World War II, working as a liaison officer for the division's armor repair units, wrote that General George S. Patton was primarily responsible for delaying the development and production of the M26. Cooper's statement and his other criticisms of the M4 Sherman have since been widely repeated by readers of his book, and have been cited as references. In 2000, the author appeared in the History Channel TV show Suicide Missions, Tank Crews of World War II to expound on his views. Tank historians, such as Richard P. Honeycutt, George Forty and Stephen Zalaga, have generally agreed that the main cause of the delay in production of the M26 was opposition to the tank from the Army Ground Forces, headed by General Leslie McNair. Zalaga in particular has identified several specific factors that led both to the delay of the M26 program and limited improvements in the firepower of the M4. Tank destroyer doctrine. McNair, who was an artillery officer, had promulgated the tank destroyer doctrine in the U.S. Army. In this doctrine, tanks were primarily for infantry support and exploitation of breakthroughs. Those tactics dictated that enemy tanks were to be engaged by tank destroyer forces, which were composed of lightly armored but relatively fast vehicles carrying more powerful anti-tank guns, as well as towed versions of these anti-tank guns. Under the tank destroyer doctrine, emphasis was placed only on improving the firepower of the tank destroyers, as there was a strong bias against developing a heavy tank to take on enemy tanks. This also limited improvements in the firepower of the M4 Sherman. Simplification of supply. McNair established a battle need criteria for acquisition of weapons in order to make best use of America's 3,000-mile-long supply line to Europe by preventing the introduction of weapons that would prove unnecessary, extravagant or unreliable on the battlefield. In his view, the introduction of a new heavy tank had problems in terms of transportation, supply, service, and reliability, and was not necessary in 1943 or early 1944. Tank development took time, and so the sudden appearance of a new tank threat could not be met quickly enough under such rigid criteria. Complacency. A sense of complacency fell upon those in charge of developing tanks in the U.S. Army because the M4 Sherman, in 1942, was considered by the Americans to be superior to the most common German tanks, the Panzer III and early models of the Panzer IV. Even through most of 1943, the 75mm M4 Sherman was adequate against the majority of German armor, although the widespread appearance of the German 7.5 cm KWK-40 tank gun during this time had led to a growing awareness that the M4 was becoming outgunned. There was insufficient forward thinking to understand that there was an ongoing arms race in tanks and that the U.S. needed to anticipate future German tank threats. The Tiger I and Panther tanks that appeared in 1943 were seen in only very limited numbers by U.S. forces and hence were not considered as major threats. The end result was that, in 1943, the Ordnance Department, lacking any guidance from the rest of the Army, concentrated its efforts in tank development mainly on its major project, the electrical transmission T-23. In contrast, 1943 saw the British begin development of the 51-ton Centurion tank and, on the Eastern Front, a full-blown tank arms race was underway, with the Soviets responding to the German heavy tanks by starting development work on the T-34/85 and IS-2 tanks. The most critical period was from mid-1943 to mid-1944, which was when the M26 could still have come to fruition in time for the Normandy invasion. During this time, development of the 90mm armored T-26 prototype continued to proceed slowly due to disagreements within the U.S. Army about its future tank needs. The details of what exactly happened during this time vary by historian, but all agree that AGF was the main source of resistance that delayed production of the T-26. Zalaga version. In his 2008 book Armored Thunderbolt, Zalaga significantly revised an earlier version of this story which had appeared in his 2000 book M26 M46 Pershing Tank 1943-53, quoting from a much more extensive list of original documents from the Ordnance Department, Army Ground Forces and General McNair's correspondence. In September-October 1943, a series of discussions occurred over the issue of beginning production of the T-26E1, which was advocated by the head of the armored force, General Jacob de Villers. Ordnance favored its pet project, the 76mm gun, electrical transmission T-23. Theater commanders generally favored a 76mm gun medium tanks such as the T-23, and were against a heavy 90mm gun tank. However, testing of the T-23 at Fort Knox had demonstrated reliability problems in the electrical transmission of which most Army commanders were unaware. The new 76mm M1A1 gun approved for the M4 Sherman seemed to address concerns about firepower against the German tanks. All participants in the debate were, however, unaware of the inadequacy of the 76mm gun against the frontal armor of the Panther tank, as they had not researched the effectiveness of this gun against the new German tanks, which had already been encountered in combat. General Leslie J. McNair had agreed to the production of the 76mm M4 Sherman, and he strongly opposed the additional production of the T-26E1. In the fall of 1943, he wrote this letter to de Villers, responding to the latter's advocacy of the T-26E1. The M4 tank, particularly the M4A3, has been widely hailed as the best tank on the battlefield today. There are indications that the enemy concurs in this view. Apparently, The M4 is an ideal combination of mobility, dependability, speed, protection, and firepower. Other than this particular request which represents the British view there has been no call from any theatre for a 90mm tank gun. There appears to be no fear on the part of our forces of the German Mark VI tank. There can be no basis for the T-26 tank other than the conception of a tank versus tank duel which is believed unsound and unnecessary. Both British and American battle experience has demonstrated that the anti-tank gun in suitable number and disposed properly is the master of the tank. Any attempt to armor and gun tanks so as to outmatch anti-tank guns is foredoomed to failure. There is no indication that the 76mm anti-tank gun is inadequate against the German Mark VI tank. General de Veilles pressed on with his advocacy for the T-26, going over McNair's head to General George Marshall, and on December 16, 1943, Marshall overruled McNair and authorized the production of 250 T-26E1 tanks. Then, in late December 1943, de Veilles was transferred to the Mediterranean, where he eventually led the invasion of southern France with the 6th Army Group. In his absence, further attempts were made to derail the T-26 program, but continued support from Generals Marshall and Eisenhower kept the production order alive. Testing and production of the T-26E1 proceeded slowly, however, and the T-26E1 did not begin full production until November 1944. These production models were designated as the T-26E3. A single prototype of a T-26 turret mounted on an M4A3 chassis was built by Chrysler in the summer of 1944, but did not progress into production. Honeycutt version, Honeycutt, working from Ordnance Department documents, reports that Ordnance requested production of 500 each of the T-23, T-25E1, and T-26E1 in October 1943. The AGF objected to the 90mm gun of the tanks, whereas the armored force wanted the 90mm gun mounted in a Sherman tank chassis. General de Veilles cabled from London a request for production of the T-26E1. In January 1944, 250 T-26E1s were authorized. General Barnes of Ordnance continued to press for production of 1,000 tanks. 40 version, according to 40, Ordnance recommended that 1,500 of the T-26E1 be built. The armored force recommended only 500. The AGF rejected the 90mm version of the tank, and wanted it to be built with the 76mm gun instead. Somehow, Ordnance managed to get production of the T-26E1 started in November 1944. 40 primarily quoted from a post-war report from the Ordnance Department, production, regardless of how it came about, production finally began in November 1944. 10 T-26E3 tanks were produced that month at the Fisher Tank Arsenal, 30 in December, 70 in January 1945, and 132 in February. The Detroit Tank Arsenal also started production in March 1945, and the combined output was 194 tanks for that month. Production continued through the end of the war, and over 2,000 were produced by the end of 1945. Following its introduction into combat in Europe, the T-26E3 tanks were redesignated as the M26 in March 1945. Super Pershing. The 90mm M3 gun of the Pershing was similar to the German 88mm KWK-36 used on the Tiger I. In an effort to match the firepower of the Tiger II's more powerful 88mm KWK-43, the T-15E1 90mm gun was developed and mounted in a T-26E1 in January 1945. This tank was designated T-26E1-1. The T-15E1 gun was 73 calibers in length and had a much longer high-capacity chamber. This gave it a muzzle velocity of 3,750 foot per second with a T-30E16 APCR shot and could penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at up to 2,600 lid. This model used single-piece 50-inch long ammunition and was the only Super Pershing sent to Europe. A second pilot tank was converted from a T-26E3 and used a modified T-15E2 gun that had two-piece ammunition. 25 of these tanks were built and designated as the T-26E4. An improved mounting removed the need for stabilizer springs. Post-war, two M26 tanks had the T-54 gun installed, which had the same long gun barrel, but the ammunition cartridge was designed to be shorter and fatter, while still retaining the propellant force of the original round. They also had the muzzle brake and bore evacuator from the M3A1 gun of the M26A1 and M46. The tanks were designated as the M26E1 tank, but lack of funds cut off further production. Post-World War II, in May 1946, due to changing conceptions of the U.S. Army's tank needs, the M26 was reclassified as a medium tank. Designed as a heavy tank, the Pershing was a significant upgrade from the M4 Sherman in terms of firepower and protection. On the other hand, its mobility was unsatisfactory for a medium tank and its transmission was somewhat unreliable. In 1948, the M26E2 version was developed with a new power plant. Eventually the new version was redesignated the M46 General Patton and 1160 M26s were rebuilt to this new standard. Thus the M26 became a base of the Patton tank series, which replaced it in early 1950s. The M47 Patton was an M46 Patton with a new turret. The later M48 Patton and M60 Patton, which saw service in later Vietnam and Mideast conflicts and still serve in active duty in many nations today, were evolutionary redesigns of the original layout set down by the Pershing. Combat history: World War II. Development of the M26 during World War II was prolonged by a number of factors, the most important being opposition to the tank from Army ground forces. As a result, only the initial 20 M26 tanks deployed to Europe in January 1945 saw combat in World War II. Europe. The heavy U.S. tank losses in the Battle of the Bulge against a concentrated German tank force composed of some 400 Panther tanks, as well as Tiger II tanks and other German armored fighting vehicles, revealed the deficiencies in the M4 Shermans and tank destroyers on the U.S. side. The British forces' armour was somewhat better equipped to deal with such a force, having adapted some Shermans to carry a more powerful 17-pounder gun. On December 22, 1944, while the battle still raged, the brand new T-26E3 tanks were ordered to be deployed to Europe. The unexpected German tank attack had settled the question once and for all as to whether the T-26 was needed. 20 were sent in the first shipment arriving at the port of Antwerp in January 1945. They were given to the 1st Army, split between the 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions. A total of 310 T-26E3 tanks would be sent to Europe before VE Day, but only the first 20 would see any combat action. In February 1945, General Gladian Barnes, Chief of the Research and Development Section of Army Ordnance, personally led a special team to the European theatre, called the Zebra Mission. Its purpose was to support the T-26E3 tanks, which still had teething problems, as well as to test other new weapons. After training the tank crews, the T-26E3 tanks were first committed to combat on February 25, with the 3rd Armoured Division, in the fighting for the Ruhr River. On February 26, a T-26E3 named Fireball was knocked out in an ambush at Elsdorf while overwatching a roadblock. Silhouetted by a nearby fire, the Pershing was in a disadvantageous position. A concealed Tiger tank fired 3 shots from about 100 yards. The first penetrated the turret through the machine gun port in the mantlet, killing both the gunner and the loader. The second shot hit the gun barrel, causing the round that was in the chamber to fire with the effect of distorting the barrel. The last shot glanced off the turret side, taking off the upper cupola hatch. While backing up to escape, the Tiger became entangled in debris and was abandoned by the crew. Fireball was quickly repaired and returned to service on March 7. Shortly afterward, also at Elsdorf, another T-26E3 knocked out a Tiger I and 2 Panzer IVs. the Tiger was knocked out at 9:00 with the 90mm HVAPT-30 E16 ammunition. Photographs of this knocked-out Tiger I in Honeycutt's book showed a penetration through the front gun mantlet. On March 6, just after the 3rd Armored Division had entered the city of Cologne, a famous tank duel took place. A Panther tank on the street in the front of Cologne Cathedral was laying in wait for enemy tanks. Two M4 Sherman were supporting infantry and came up on the same street as the Panther. They ended up stopping just before the cathedral because of rubble in the street and didn't see the enemy Panther. The lead Sherman was knocked out, killing 3 of the 5 crew. A T-26E3 was in the next street over and was called over to engage the Panther. What happened next was described by the T-26E3 gunner Corporal Clarence Smower. "We were told to just move into the intersection far enough to fire into the side of the enemy tank, which had its gun facing up the other street. However, as we entered the intersection, our driver had his periscope turned toward the Panther and saw their gun turning to meet us. When I turned our turret, I was looking into the Panther's gun tube. So instead of stopping and becoming an easy target, our driver kept going through the intersection, so I fired a round and hit the enemy tank. The Panther was dispatched and burned for 3 days after the duel, with 2 of the crew surviving." The action was recorded by a Signal Corps cameraman Tech SGT Jim Bates. On the same day, another T-26E3 was knocked out in the town of Neil near Cologne, by an rarely seen Nashorn 88mm SP anti-tank gun, at a range of under 300 yd. There were 2 other tank engagements involving the T-26E3, with 1 Tiger I knocked out during the fighting around Cologne, and 1 Panzer IV knocked out at Mannheim. The T-26E3s with the 9th Armored Division saw action in fighting around the Ruhr River with 1 Pershing disabled by 2 hits from a German 150 on-field gun. 4 T-26E3s were involved in the 9th Armored Division's dramatic dash to take the bridge at Remagen, providing fire support to the infantry in order to take the bridgehead before the Germans could blow it up. Some of the division's other tanks were able to cross the bridge, but the T-26E3s were too large and heavy to cross the damaged bridge and had to wait 5 days before getting across the river by barge. Europe's bridges were in general not designed for heavy loads, which had been one of the original objections to sending a heavy tank to Europe. Super Pershing. A single Super Pershing was shipped to Europe and given additional armor to the gun mantlet and front hull by the maintenance unit before being assigned to one of the tank crews of the 3rd Armored Division. An account of the combat actions of this tank appeared in the war memoir Another River, Another Town, by John P. Irwin, who was the tank gunner. Zaliger described 3 actions in his book. On April 4, the Super Pershing engaged and destroyed a German tank, or something resembling a tank, at a range of 1,500 yd. On April 12, the Super Pershing claimed a German tank of unknown type. On April 21, the Super Pershing was involved in a short-range tank duel with a German tank. The engagement was a brief encounter. The German tank missed the initial shot. The Super Pershing responded with a quick shot, but it had fired a high-explosive round which had no effect on the German tank. The crew then apparently felt something slam into the turret mantlet, although it is unknown whether this was a shot from the German tank or it was from another anti-tank weapon of some sort. The Super Pershing then knocked it out with a shot to the belly as the German tank tried to climb over a pile of rubble. Irwin described this German tank as a Tiger II, but Zaliger was skeptical of this claim, as there was a very low number of Tiger II tanks in Western Europe in 1945. After the war, the single Super Pershing in Europe was last photographed in a vehicle dump in Kassel, Germany, and was most likely scrapped. Okinawa, in May 1945, as fierce fighting continued on the island of Okinawa, and M4 tank losses mounted, plans were made to ship the M26 Pershing tanks to that battle. A cargo ship carrying 12 Pershing tanks departed on May 31, but the tanks were not completely offloaded on the beach at Nha, Okinawa until August 4. By then, fighting on Okinawa had come to an end, and VJ Day followed on August 15. Korean War. the M26 saw service in the Korean War. When the war began in June 1950, the 4 American infantry divisions on occupation duty in Japan had no medium tanks at all, having only one active tank company each. When these divisions were sent to Korea at the end of June 1950, they soon found that the 75mm gun on the M24 could not penetrate the armor of North Korean T-34 tanks, which had no difficulty penetrating the M24's thin armor. 3 M26 Pershing tanks were found in poor condition in a Tokyo ordnance depot. They were hastily brought back into operation with missing fan belts improvised. These 3 M26s were formed into a provisional tank platoon commanded by Lieutenant Samuel Fowler and sent to Korea in mid-July. When used to defend the town of Chinju, the tanks soon overheated when the substitute fan belts stretched and the cooling fans stopped working, and so the only 3 American medium tanks in Korea were lost. More medium tanks began arriving in Korea at the end of July 1950. Although no armored divisions were sent because the initial response from battlefield commanders was Korea isn't good tank country, 6 Army infantry divisions and 1 Marine division were deployed. Each Army infantry division should have had 1 divisional tank battalion of 69 tanks, and each Army infantry regiment should have had a company of 22 tanks. The Marine division had a tank battalion of 70 gun tanks and 9 combination flamethrower howitzer tanks, and each Marine infantry regiment had an anti-tank platoon with 5 tanks each. While tables of organization and equipment mandated that all tank platoon vehicles should be M26 Pershings, with howitzer tanks in company headquarters and light tanks in reconnaissance units only, some units had a shortfall that had to be filled with other tanks. The 70th Tank Battalion at Fort Knox, Kentucky had pulled World War II Memorial M26s off of pedestals and reconditioned them for use, but had to fill out 2 companies with M4A3s. The 72nd Tank Battalion at Fort Lewis, Washington and the 73rd Tank Battalion at Fort Benning, Georgia were fully equipped with M26s. The 89th Medium Tank Battalion was constituted in Japan with 3 companies of reconditioned M4A3s and 1 of M26s from various bases in the Pacific. Due to the shortage of M26s, most regimental tank companies had M4A3 Shermans instead. 2 battalions detached from the 2nd Armored Division at Fort Hood, Texas, the 6th Medium and 64th Heavy Tank Battalions, were fully equipped with M46 Patton tanks. The 1st Marine Division at Camp Pendleton, California had all M4A3 howitzer tanks, which were replaced with M26s just days before boarding ships for Korea. A total of 309 M26 Pershings were rushed to Korea in 1950. A 1954 survey concluded that there were in all 119 tank versus tank actions involving U.S. Army and Marine units during the Korean War, with 97 T-34-85 tanks knocked out and another 18 probables. The M4A3E8 was involved in 50% of the tank actions, the M26 in 32%, and the M46 in 10%. The M26 per meter 46 proved to be an overmatch for the T-34-85 as its 90 HVAP round could punch all the way through the T-34 from the front glacis armor to the back, whereas the T-34-85 had difficulty penetrating the armor of the M26/46. The M4A3E8, firing 76 HVAP rounds which were widely available during the Korean War, was a closer match to the T-34-85 as both tanks could destroy each other at normal combat ranges. After November 1950, North Korean armor was rarely encountered. China entered the conflict in February 1951 with 4 regiments of tanks. However, because these Chinese tanks were dispersed with the infantry, tank-to-tank battles with UN forces were uncommon. With the marked decrease in tank-to-tank actions, the automotive deficiencies of the M26 in the mountainous Korean terrain became more of a liability, and so all M26s were withdrawn from Korea during 1951 and replaced with M4A3 Shermans and M46 Pattons. The M45 howitzer tank variant was only used by the assault gun platoon of the 6th Medium Tank Battalion, and these 6 vehicles were withdrawn by January 1951. Europe. After the end of World War II, U.S. Army units on occupation duty in Germany were converted into constabulary units, a quasi-police force designed to control the flow of refugees and black marketing. Combat units were converted to light motorized units and spread throughout the U.S. occupation zone. By the summer of 1947, the Army required a combat reserve to back up the thinly spread constabulary. In the following year, the 1st Infantry Division was reconstituted and consolidated, containing 3 regimental tank companies and a divisional tank battalion. The 1948 tables of organization and equipment for an infantry division included 123 M26 Pershing tanks and 12 M45 howitzer tanks. In the summer of 1951, 3 more infantry divisions and the 2nd Armored Division was sent to West Germany as a part of the NATO augmentation program. While M26 Pershings disappeared from Korea during 1951, tank units deploying to West Germany were equipped with them, until replaced with M47 Pattons during 1952-53. The 1952-53 tables of organization and equipment for an infantry division included 135 M47 Patton tanks replacing M26s and M45s. In 1952, the Belgian Army received 423 M26 and M26A1 Pershings, leased for free as part of a mutual defense assistance program, then the official designation of U.S. military aid to its allies. The tanks were mostly used to equip mobilizable reserve units of battalions strength, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Ra Copyright Gymünster Guides Regiment Jidson. 7th, 9th and 10th Ra Copyright Gymünster Lanciers Regiment Lanciers and finally the 2nd, 3rd and 5th Bataillon tanks Lourdes Bataillons Wehr tanks. However, in the spring of 1953, M26s for 3 months equipped the 1st Heavy Tank Battalion of the 1st Infantry Division, an active unit, before they were replaced by M47s. In 1961, the number of reserve units was reduced and the reserve system reorganized, with the M26s equipping the 1st and 3rd Escadron de Tanks Tank Escadron as a general reserve of the infantry arm. In 1969, all M26s were phased out. As the U.S. Army units in West Germany re-equipped with M47s in 1952-1953, France and Italy also received M26 Pershings. While France quickly replaced them with M47 Pattons, Italy continued to use them operationally through 1963. Variants: M26, M3 gun with double baffle muzzle brake. Main production model: M26A1, M3A1 gun with bore evacuator and single baffle muzzle brake. T26E1-1 version armed with a T15E1 large exterior stabilizer spring single-piece ammo. T26E4 experimental version armed with a long T15E2 gun 2-part ammunition, improved mounting removed the need for springs. M26E1 longer gun, single-part ammunition T54 gun. M26E2 new engine and transmission and M3A1 gun. Ended up as the M46 Patton, T26E2, eventually standardized for use as the heavy tank M45 a close support vehicle with a 105 mm howitzer. T26E5 prototype with thicker armor a maximum of 279 mm. Operators: a United States, a Belgium, an Italy, a France, a Soviet Union. See also. Overviews on related topics: armored warfare, tanks in the United States, tanks of the U.S. in the World Wars, tanks of the U.S. in the Cold War, tank destroyer battalion, relevant vehicles, 240 on T-92 howitzer motor carriage, Centurion tank, the equivalent British tank of the same period, list of M-series military vehicles, G numbers, M1 combat car, tanks of comparable role, performance and era, Tiger I Panther approximate German equivalent, IS-2 approximate Soviet equivalent, notes. References: Cooper, Belton White Death Traps, Presidio Press, 1998, Novato, California, ISBN 0-89141-670-6. Kooks, A.D. Staff Memorandum U.S. Armor in the Anti-Tank Role, Korea, 1950 OS 45. Dest, Carlo. Patton, A Genius for War, 1995, HarperCollins Publishers, ISBN 0-06-016455-7, 40, George. United States Tanks of World War II, 1983, Blandford Press, ISBN 0-7137-1214-7, Voss, Christopher F., Editor. The Encyclopedia of Tanks and Armored Fighting Vehicles, 2002, Thunder Bay Press, ISBN 1-57145-806-9. Honeycutt, R. P. Pershing, A History of the Medium Tank T-20 Series, 1996, Feist Publications, ISBN 1-112-95450-3. Owen, John P. Another River, Another Town, 2002, J. K. Lambert, ISBN 0-375-50775-2. Gentz, Thomas. Germany's Panther Tank, 1995, Schiffer Publishing, ISBN 0-88740-812-5. Zalaga, Stephen J., Brian, Tony, Laurier, Jim. M26 M46 Pershing Tank 1943 1953, 2000, Osprey Publishing, ISBN 1-84176-202-4. Zalaga, Stephen J. Armored Thunderbolt, 2008, Stackpole Books, ISBN 0-8117-0424-6. Zalaga, Stephen J. Panther vs. Sherman, 2008, Osprey Publishing, ISBN 978-1-84603-292-9. Zalaga, Stephen J. T-34-85 vs. M26 Pershing, Korea 1950, 2010, Osprey Publishing, ISBN 978-1-84603-990-4. External links. Tanks Are Mighty Fine Things, 1946. A Euro story of development and manufacture of tanks by Chrysler Corporation in World War II. Pershing Tank Packs 90 mm. Punch, July 1945. Popular Science article, AFV database, Armor reference articles, on war specifications, World War II vehicles, M26 Pershing prototypes and variants at WWII. Photo.mimoswell.com. Photos of the damaged M26 Fireball tank duel at the Cologne Cathedral. A Euro Pershing vs. Panther.